Welcome to Stories of History. I'm Virgilio, your guide, and today we're diving deep into a story. It's glamorous and tragic, the assassination of Empress Elizabeth of Austria, better known as Sisi, now Sisi. She was practically synonymous with beauty and grace, adored by her people, known throughout Europe for her elegance, but sadly also known for her tragic life, culminating in a shocking event. In Geneva in 1898, imagine a crisp autumn day. On the shores of Lake Geneva, Sisi's about to board a ferry, and suddenly, fatally stabbed. Her attacker was Luigi Lucheni, an anarchist. And what's particularly intriguing, Sisi wasn't even his original target. So who was this Luigi Lucheni? And what drove him to commit such a brazen act? Well, to understand Lucheni, we need to understand the term lumpenproletariat. Sounds a bit academic, I know, but it essentially refers to the most impoverished and marginalized segment of the working class. These are individuals often lacking the resources, education, or social connections to improve their lot. And Lucheni fit this description perfectly. His life was a brutal testament to hardship, starting with a childhood spent shuttling between orphanages and families who exploited him for cheap labor. He worked tirelessly, yet could barely scrape by. It's a story that sadly resonates even today, a stark reminder of the persistent struggles faced by so many. At the bottom of the economic ladder, this life of unrelenting hardship fueled a deep resentment within Lucheni. He saw himself as a righteous avenger of the working class, harboring a profound hatred for the wealthy elite, whom he blamed for his suffering. In fact, his initial plan was to assassinate the Duke of Orleans, a symbol of the aristocracy he so despised. However, a change in the Duke's travel plans forced Lucheni to seek a new target, and that's where Sisi, in a tragic twist of fate, entered the picture. It was almost as if, to Lucheni, any prominent figure would suffice. Anyone who represented the system that had kept him down. They were all, in his eyes, symbols of oppression and injustice. Now Lucheni's act, it wasn't simply an isolated incident. It was part of a larger wave of anarchist attacks sweeping across Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And many of these attacks, like Lucheni's, targeted heads of state, figures who represented the established order that anarchists sought to dismantle. These attacks weren't random acts of violence. They were deliberate acts of what anarchists termed propaganda by the deed. It was a strategy built on the belief that dramatic acts of violence would speak louder than words, shaking the public from complacency and exposing the brutality of the state. They believed that these shocking acts would serve as a catalyst for revolution, inspiring the masses to rise up and overthrow their oppressors. This tactic, while extreme, wasn't entirely unfounded. At the time, peaceful protests and calls for reform were often met with indifference or even violent suppression by authorities. So for some disillusioned and desperate individuals, violence became a way to make their voices heard. A tragic, albeit misguided, form of political expression. And this wasn't just limited to isolated cases. There was a string of anarchist attacks in Spain, for example, targeting prominent figures and institutions. These actions served as stark reminders of the simmering discontent that permeated society, a discontent fueled by vast economic inequalities and political disenfranchisement. But let's shift our focus now to Sisi herself, because while she was undeniably known for her beauty, her life was far more complex and fascinating than just a fairy tale. She was known to chafe under the rigid protocols of the Viennese court, seeking escape through extensive travels. Corfu, Madeira, Trieste, even Majorca. She frequented them all, immersing herself in different cultures and landscapes, perhaps seeking a sense of freedom and autonomy that eluded her in her constricted royal life. And it's worth noting that she was likely one of the first Austrians to visit Majorca as a tourist. This speaks to her independent spirit, her willingness to break free from convention and explore new horizons. However, beneath this outward image of elegance and freedom, Sisi grappled with deep personal demons. She was deeply insecure about her appearance, waging a constant battle against weight gain and aging, obsessively striving to maintain her youthful image. This obsession, coupled with the pressures of court life, took a heavy toll on her mental health. She struggled with depression, bulimia, and anorexia. She was known to carry a scale everywhere she went, a poignant symbol of her relentless pursuit of an unattainable ideal. As if that wasn't enough, she self-medicated with cocaine and morphine injections, ostensibly to combat depression and induce sleep. This, of course, only compounded her problems, revealing a woman trapped in a vicious cycle of physical and psychological torment. So here we have this complex, troubled woman, seeking solace in travel and battling her own inner demons, a woman who tragically found herself in the wrong place at the wrong time. What makes this story even more tragic is that Sisi was a surprisingly easy target for someone like Lucheni. On that fateful day, she was dressed casually, in mourning clothes for her son, blending in with the crowd. And to compound her vulnerability, she had no security detail with her, making her an easy mark for someone with ill intentions. The attack itself was chilling in its simplicity. Lucheni rarely bumped into Sisi, causing her to stumble. The wound was so small, so seemingly insignificant at first, that it barely registered. But as the ferry pulled away from the shore, the true horror of what had transpired began to unfold. Sisi slowly began to succumb to internal bleeding, a slow, agonizing death, as the vessel carried her away from safety and towards her tragic end. And what about Lucheni? Well, he was quickly apprehended. And much to everyone's surprise, he seemed almost proud of his actions. He fully expected to be executed, envisioning himself as a martyr for the anarchist cause, his name forever etched in the annals of history, as a champion of the oppressed. But here's the irony, the ultimate twist in this tragic tale. Lucheni's plan went awry even in death. Frustrated that he was denied the martyr's death he craved, he ended up taking his own life in prison, another victim, in a sense, of the very system he so vehemently opposed. It's almost as if, even in his final act, he couldn't escape the pattern of disappointment and despair that seemed to define his existence. Sisi's assassination, however unintended by Lucheni, did achieve a certain degree of the propaganda he so desperately sought. Her name became tragically linked with anarchist violence, a symbol of their desperate struggle against the established order. But the question remains, did it truly improve the lives of the proletariat, the very people he claimed to champion? That, my friends, is a question we'll explore further as we delve deeper into this fascinating and tragic tale. It's a heart-wrenching story, isn't it? A clash between a woman of immense privilege, yet burdened by personal struggles, and a man driven to desperate measures by the harsh realities of his existence. Lucheni's story serves as a stark reminder that even amidst the opulence and grandeur of the late 19th century, Europe was a cauldron of social unrest. Beneath the surface of progress and prosperity, deep-seated inequalities festered, breeding resentment and pushing individuals like Lucheni to the brink. He wasn't simply a lone wolf, driven by blind rage. He was a product of his environment, a symptom of a system that had failed him, and countless others like him. His act, horrific as it was, compels us to confront these inequalities, to examine the conditions that can lead individuals to such extremes. And this idea of propaganda by the deed deserves a closer look. It offers a window into the anarchist mindset of the era. Anarchists, disillusioned with traditional forms of protest, believed that only through dramatic acts of violence could they truly expose the inherent brutality of the state and awaken the masses to the need for radical change. To them, violence wasn't simply a means to an end. It was a form of communication, a way to shock the public out of complacency and force them to confront the injustices that permeated society. They believed that these acts, as shocking and reprehensible as they might seem, would serve as a catalyst, sparking a revolution that would ultimately lead to a more just and equitable society. Now, it's easy to condemn these acts of violence outright, but to truly understand them, we must consider the context in which they occurred. Remember, this was a time when peaceful protests and calls for reform were often met with brutal suppression. For those who had grown weary of waiting for change, who had lost faith in the system's ability to self-correct, violence became a tragic, yet in their minds, necessary tool for achieving their goals. Think about some of the other anarchist attacks that occurred during this period. The assassination of Spanish Prime Minister Antonio Cardovas del Castillo in 1897, for example, or the bombing of the Liceu Opera House in Barcelona that same year. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a larger wave of anarchist violence that swept across Europe, each act a desperate cry for attention, a violent manifestation of the deep-seated frustration and anger that simmered beneath the surface of society. What's particularly striking is the similarity between these acts. Each attacker acted alone, driven by their own personal convictions, and fueled by a shared sense of injustice. This highlights the individualistic nature of anarchism at the time. There wasn't decentralized leadership or a grand coordinated plan. It was more like a shared ideology, a common thread of discontent that manifested itself in these isolated yet impactful acts of violence. It's almost like a dark reflection of the very system they were fighting against, this idea of each individual acting in their own self-interest. But in this case, they believed they were acting for the greater good, for the liberation of the oppressed and the dismantling of a system they saw as inherently corrupt. Now, while the transcript you provided highlights anarchist attacks in Spain, it's important to remember that this wasn't a phenomenon confined to one country. Anarchist movements were active throughout Europe, and their tactics, while shocking to many, were a reflection of broader social and political tensions of the time. So while it's tempting to focus on the specific details of these attacks, it's crucial to remember that they were symptoms of a much larger problem. They were manifestations of a system struggling to adapt to the changing needs and demands of its people, a system ripe for disruption. And while these acts of violence may have achieved a certain degree of notoriety, the question remains, did they truly bring about the change that anarchists so desperately sought? Did they improve the life of the working class? Did they lead to a more just and equitable society? Or did they simply perpetuate a cycle of violence and repression, ultimately hindering the very progress they hoped to achieve? These are complex questions, ones that continue to be debated by historians and activists alike. And while there may not be easy answers, it's crucial that we continue to grapple with these questions, to examine the motivations behind these acts, and to consider the effectiveness of their tactics, because ultimately, the story of Sisi and Lucheni is a story about power, about the struggle between those who have it and those who don't. It's a story about the desperation that can arise when individuals feel unheard, unseen, and trapped within a system that seems rigged against them. And while their story may have taken place over a century ago, the questions it raises about inequality, justice, and the use of violence to achieve political change are as relevant today as they were then. It's a reminder that history, while often tragic, can offer valuable lessons for navigating the complexities of our own time. Tough questions indeed, ones that historians still debate today. It's easy to condemn violence outright, to just view it as, like a barbaric relic of a bygone era. But I think it's essential to at least try to understand the context in which these acts occurred, to grapple with the desperation and frustration that fueled them. For Lucheni, and for many others like him, violence wasn't a first choice. It was a last resort. It was a way to strike back against a system that seemed impervious to their pleas, a system that seemed to perpetuate their suffering. And in a way, if they weren't entirely wrong, the systems of power in Europe at the time were deeply flawed, often blind to the plight of the most vulnerable. But does that justify violence as a means for achieving change? That's a question each of us has to wrestle with, a question that transcends the specifics of Sisi and Lucheni's story and resonates throughout history, right up to the present day. It forces us to confront the complexities of morality, the gray areas, where right and wrong become blurred. The story of Sisi and Lucheni, in its tragic intersection, highlights the profound disparities that existed in Europe at the time. On one hand, you had Sisi, the embodiment of privilege and beauty, yet trapped in a gilded cage, battling her own inner demons. And on the other, you had Lucheni, a man consumed by poverty and hardship, driven to a horrific act by the very system that had failed him. Their encounter, brief and fatal, serves as a microcosm of the larger social and political forces at play. It's a story about the consequences of unchecked inequality, about the ways in which desperation can warp our perceptions and drive us to extreme measures. It's a reminder that history isn't just a collection of dates and names. It's a tapestry woven for the lives of real people, each with their own hopes, dreams, and struggles. And sometimes those lives collide in ways that are both unexpected and tragic, leaving behind a legacy of questions that continue to haunt us. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep those minds engaged. Until next time on Stories of History.